A very warm welcome, everyone, to this STR conversation session. Really excited to have all of you here, and I think a good number of participants are joining in as well. We had a wonderful list of people who have signed up and registered for this event, so it's really excited. My name is Koen Heimeriks, and together with Christina Fang, I've been fortunate enough to be able to organize and host today's STR session. Unfortunately, Christina is saying hi to every one of you and cannot join for unfortunate reasons. But I'm sending her my very best, and she's certainly with us here today in spirit. So I'm really excited to have all of you here. Would like to also emphasize that today's session is going to be, in my book, very, very exciting. Looking forward and backward to research into what I believe are and has been for a long time one of the most exciting parts of our fields of study in strategy, as well as related subfields. So the very intersection of organizational learning and behavioral strategy is what we're going to dive into today. And I guess most importantly, I think we have an amazing set of panelists here, which I think will guarantee an amazing set of insights and contributions. Not trying to overpromise, but I'm very, very excited to see all of this happening today. So before I thank our panelists here, I would like to also emphasize all the work that's been going on here on the background and the leadership team that has made this all possible. So represented here, amongst others by Deepak Samaja and Dave Maslak. Really thanks to all of your leadership and contributions that you're making to our division and for the field. I think that's deeply appreciated. So, as said, really, really happy that I can welcome an amazing set of 6 top-notch panelists here. I think a lot of you, I'm sure will, the very panelists themselves. I will not sort of sum up all of their contributions nor their background. I think all of these folks speak for themselves. I think they've been invited to basically look at the intersection of org learning and behavioral strategy, to really emphasize and look at 3 key aspects here. So first of all, what is the past of the very nexus of organizational learning and behavioral strategy? What are the key insights of past research in these 2 domains? Insights on the main contributions and limitations of past work in these, at this very intersection. The other point is the present. So what are current approaches and works that have really advanced research at this intersection, as we are particularly emphasizing, looking for some exemplar studies that may or not be, limited to theoretical, methodological, and or other types of contributions at the intersection. And finally, and perhaps also, very interestingly, or most interestingly, in your mind, what are the key areas for work to explore at the intersection of organizational learning and behavioral strategy moving forward, right? So how can some of these questions be best addressed that you emphasize? And what are, suggestions for junior scholars who are interested and excited by this field? So, we have decided to both go in alphabetical order and start with last name and ladies first here. So it's really, a great pleasure and honor, Linda, to have you here. Thank you. Alongside a big thanks to all of our panelists, of course. Each panelist will have 7 + 3 minutes of Q&A. So 7 minutes presentation, 3 minutes Q&A. And we will have time for Q&A at the very end. So please stay tuned in. Linda, if I, it's wonderful to have you here. Can I invite you, please, to maybe kick off with some of your thoughts on this topic?
Thank you, Koen. It's wonderful to be here with a great group of colleagues on an interesting and very important topic. So let me try to share. It's not what I wanted to share.
Doesn't look like Pittsburgh here.
It's changed, global warming, So do my slides, are they showing now?
Yes, they're showing.
Okay.
Well, we're
great.
getting the speaker view. I think you want to flip so we just see the presentation slide.
Okay. How do I do that?
I think it's on the top.
See
I
the little
slideshow.
swap up at the top left? There's a swap.
It says swap displays,
Yeah, swap
Top
displays.
left.
That's what you want.
or maybe use slideshow. I think both might work.
Yeah, I'm not seeing that, and I'm going to stop sharing and start again. Maybe we should do alphabetical order by last name. Sorry, by first name.
Don't worry, Lynn, don't worry.
Yeah.
If we want, you could do the flip. Not that much.
Yes, and I'm also happy, Linda, if you want me to present the slides, that's also great. You drop me a quick email, I can also upload them and see whether I can make it work for you.
I don't see Linda on the screen anymore.
Do you want me to do your other heuristic of first names and whatever you want?
And why don't you just do it, and then Linda will come back.
Let's it. I think she actually signed off, right? She's probably good. Dan, can you maybe start if
Sure.
sharing? Thank you very much, Dan.
Okay, so we're robust, we're learners, and we adapt. So let me just sort of a broad framing. We have behavioral strategy, we have org learning, and here's the Venn diagram. So it strikes me there are some conversations and some issues, say around the judgment decision-making kind of conversation, behavioral decision theory, it's behavioral strategy. It's really important. How does this individual actor think about the world and so on? There's some of the conversation in org learning. It's important, but not necessarily strategic. So let's understand how the factory operates. Amy Edmondson's what's going on in the hospital room, terribly important, but more at this operational level. I think the overlapping part of the Venn diagram, from my point of view, is, well, there's probably more than one person involved. And they are dealing with strategic problems of strategic imports and complexity, right? So just a kind of a very broad framing. A little maybe more edgy, contestable perhaps, or is there's a third conversation that I think operate, and I've given it the imperialist imagery of planting flags on what for the actors are new territory, but actually they're already native residents, indigenous people. So, the dynamic capability conversation really comes out of the resource view of the firm. So firms are different. We have some insight about that. It would be interesting to understand where those differences come from. And hence David Teese gives us the dynamic capability, introduces the dynamic capability conversation. I am both supportive and sympathetic and simultaneously curmudgeonly. Okay, the latter aspect of, in many respects, certainly the early variants of this conversation seem somewhat, were strikingly disconnected from work on organizational learning. And so we as indigenous people had already kind of been there before this term had been expressed. And in some ways, both helpful and maybe distracting, right? So I think some of the resource dynamic capability conversation has a kind of somewhat reductionist sensibility. And, for me, I think about organizations, these complex adaptive systems. And so isolating a particular element of a complex adaptive system, it's problematic, it's complicated. It is the interplay among elements. John will tell us about a systems point of view, right? So similarly, I have a kind of somewhat system sensibility. And in particular, I think it's important, and sort of some of my own work, thinking about organizations as a multi-level system. And once you do that, you recognize learning at one level. Say in this early work with Jim, using the example of that contemporary time of lean production, if I adapt through inventory, I'm not rethinking my broader processes, right? So I adopt this lower level that actually buffers higher order learning, so we can have these kind of learning substitutes. Jim's classic exploration exploitation, people love the poetry. You think about the sort of the modeling element, actually slow learning at the individual level facilitated organizational adaptation. So it's just once you embrace a complex adaptive system, this sort of where is the magic element kind of quest, proves perhaps less useful. Building on some early work of Bergman, I've kind of embraced sort of this imagery of the organization as this ecology of projects that are getting culled and cultivated by this kind of Mendelian CEO with their perspective about kind of creating an artificial selection environment. So, I think as org learning scholars, we have this sensibility, and it's really quite critical. And I think it makes it distinct from some of the other related conversations going on in the field as well. I think kind of at the moment and then going forward, so it's a little bit of past, we're a really exciting moment. We're in this sort of magic time of intentional experimentation. So, there's an ancient tradition, whether on the behavioral side, Kahneman, Tversky, or it's March and Simon, but here in 2025, the world has come around to think about learning and to think about these issues, not always necessarily expressed in our ways. And, from a range, from the sort of intentional experimentation that embraces a kind of optimization perspective as in real options, from a kind of conscious experimentation of the A/B trial or the RCT, and obviously of the moment, machine learning. And machine learning basically in the AI driven by sort of two fundamental learning processes, the kind of associative learning, not quite Linda's transactive memory, but a little bit analogous of kind of what goes with what, and then the fundamental engine of reinforcement learning. So yes, Sutton and Bardo is different than Thorndike, but they are descendants and not unrelated. And then we have sort of learning in situ of the startup and the lean startup going through its search and discovery processes. So, these very, contemporary, hot, seemingly new conversations, I think it's helpful to situate them in the deeper intellectual tradition that's teed up by this session, represented by the scholars and this tradition. I think it's really, though, important is to recognize the learning problem is not the laboratory experiment problem. And so I'm sort of citing a recent paper that came out in December that Ron Adler and I did. And I think in some of the conversation, the contemporary usage is, experiment in a kind of a colloquial term versus experiment in the sense of the scientific enterprise. And they're rather different. And as I note here, experience is not equal experiment. So among the things I would flag, the challenges of inference and interpretation. Organizational activity occurs in a context, not in a vacuum of the laboratory where we decontextualize things. So we have challenges of inference. What was that causal mechanism? Fine, you could do your RCT, the sort of methodology of the moment, but we still have to recognize the latent external validity challenge of that, right? So, we worry a lot about sample selection when in the seminar room and, there was some unobserved heterogeneity, blah, blah, blah. But we give ourselves a pass when, for convenience, I picked these college sophomores or these people, on Amazon Turk or something, and that's okay somehow. So it may be RCT, but how representative is that context and those actors from other possible interests? And in that regard, I actually think it's kind of interesting to contrast A/B trial within enterprise, which in I kind of think about, okay, that's local hill climbing. We're not pretending I found some universal truth. We're saying, in this context, at this moment, B worked better than A. And so we are climbing uphill. Whereas some of our conversation around RCTs are typically suggestive of, I've identified a general truth. And I suggest some of that may be under neglecting context in some level, perhaps hubris. The other fundamental challenge when we think about learning, what is the feedback? Feedbacks, there's typically the myopia feedbacks. The observable outcomes may be only a poor reflection and shadow of the attributes we ultimately care about. So learning is not a panacea. And when you run the experiment, what was the experimental app that you got in that time frame, and how suggestive that is the ultimate consequence of the interest, and why I sort of push a lot these ideas of that artificial selection environment and the sort of constructed feedback of the measures and mechanisms we decide are possibly good proxies. Another observation Ron and I make in this context is psychologists are worried about non-replication. When you take a strategic action, the world is now different. Okay, it is not replicable. You have affected the world. I introduced this new product, this new initiative. It works or doesn't work. My ecosystem partners are going to think differently about me and the prospects of my enterprise. So in a colloquial way, there's the expression of one chance to make a first impression. And so, if things are not replicable, if we have these inference problems, it's a valuable experience. It is not an experiment, and we have to understand the important distinctions raised by that. And in closing, my Janus looking forward, looking back, again, I think there's this important, wonderful, rich intellectual tradition we can draw from that is, I think, remarkably important and relevant to many of the central concerns and conversations we're having in the strategic management field today. So thank you for letting me tee off. I hope will be a really interesting set of discussions.
Thank you very much, Dan, for kicking off and these great insights and contributions here. We have a few minutes for one or two questions. Does anyone want to come in? Please, if you could unmute and show yourself on the camera, that would be great. Any questions are welcome.
Hi, could I jump in with a question?
Please, David. Please go ahead.
Hi, Dan. I wondered. Good to see you. I wondered about the multi-level nature of organizations, and it's something that's super interesting to think about theoretically. But have you got any suggestions or recommendations for people to study it empirically? What might be good ways to do that?
Yeah, good pushback and challenge, and I sort of leave to others that harder task. We have John teed up, and actually I would point, I think some of John's work in the corporate strategy context of thinking about the corporate, role of the corporation and the business unit, and how the sort of different concerns, aspirations, goals play out is actually a really nice exemplar of kind of teasing that out. Some of Men's work kind of exploiting the interesting reporting structure of French organizations allowed them to play that a little bit between, again, the corporate and some of these underlying business units. And actually, I think, we can get to the macro, but actually I think, it's a sort of related aside, but sort of, ruminating me, and I think relevant to this kind of community. I think actually, and again, I'd point to John as important key actor here, and Willie as well, but corporate strategy, we should own more of that turf. Back to us as imperialists and playing flags, okay? It's not just a resource leverage story, and there's some incentives, and we have to worry about governance form. And so it's both an important domain, but I think it's also a domain where it may be easier and more natural to sort of see the multi-level challenge, because you've got well-defined administrative units at these kind of distinct levels, and accounting and capital structures that provide some opportunity to trace that elements. And actually, a recent paper with Brian Wu, we're kind of playing more conceptually, building on some of our earlier work, again, being, okay, me, the lazy theorist, kind of laid out, but getting a little closer to sort of the bridge to empiricism. So that's sort of where, the sort of a important phenomena and consideration, but I think a kind of also a window, perhaps a window where you might be able to kind of get some empirical traction on those elements. But yeah, good question for that.
What wonderful! Thank you, Dan. In order to keep our time a little bit here, and to secure enough time for for all presenters, maybe let's see whether we can keep questions then to the end, if everyone's okay with that. And can I invite Linda to go next, as we were anticipating you warmly, and is that okay for you, Linda?
First, my apologies. I've been talking in our part-time online hybrid program, and I don't know if my slides were fine-tuned, specialized for that. Dan, you may have a learning story about premature specialization or something. But I may just talk through this. How's that?
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
So I find it useful to, well, again, thanks for putting together this wonderful panel and on an interesting and important topic. I find it useful to think of learning in three areas: creating knowledge, retaining, and transferring. And I think we have learned the most about knowledge transfer, starting with Dan's path-breaking work on absorptive capacity. Suzlansky has done critical work. Xander and Kogut, this is a work on the early days. There's been many, many other studies. I'll put a plug in. I did a review piece in the Annual Review of Psychology that just came out in 24 on knowledge transfer. I think that's an area that we've learned a lot about. There's still room to do more. We have made a lot of progress there. The other area, I think we've made progress on knowledge creation, how knowledge is created through the interpretation of experience. There's been work on different dimensions of experience and how they can have different effects, how experience interacts with the organizational context. We could put Jim March's work on there, different kinds of experience, whether you explore versus exploit. The area that I think we know least about, and where I see tremendous opportunities and implications for strategy, is knowledge retention, or its converse, knowledge depreciation. So studies, empirical studies in different contexts have shown that knowledge can decay or depreciate, that recent experience is a more important predictor of current performance than cumulative experience. So this clearly has implications for strategy. If depreciation occurs, then, for example, a recent entrant to an industry wouldn't be at a competitive disadvantage if its recent output is comparable to its rivals. And I think there's a natural experiment that we have all been through that shows that provides enormous opportunities for studying that. And that would be the pandemic, where many organizations stopped production or slowed down production. I think that's an exogenous shock that we could use to study knowledge depreciation empirically. Another concept that I think shows promise that's already been mentioned today is this idea of transactive memory, or knowledge of who knows what. I first became interested in this topic in the late 80s when I was doing a study in 3 truck plants. And it was a quantitative assessment of learning curves and the effect of turnover and cross-shift transfer and so on. But before we began the study, we did interviews with about 15 of their managers and engineers to get their sense of what they thought was driving the learning curve, that we wanted to do that to understand the context, and also it might suggest some control variables to include. And what they told us, several of the things had been mentioned in the literature already. Increased proficiency of individuals, number 1. Number 2, changes in the tooling, the technology, the layout, number 2. Number 3 was changes in the structure and how different parts were related. But the 4th thing they said was knowing who was good at what. And that had not been mentioned in the literature yet. Now, they did not use the word transactive memory, but I learned that Wegner at the time had introduced a concept of transactive memory from a colleague, Moreland, at the University of Pittsburgh. He was a psychologist. When Wegner introduced the term, he used it to characterize the sort of specialization that occurs between people in close relationships, where maybe one person remembers the birthdays on both sides of the family, or another person remembers where to get things fixed. Dick had thought he saw that going on in the research teams he worked with, where you gravitated where one person would do the writing, one person would do the data analysis, one person might be the contact with the site, and so on. And I'd had this experience suggesting from these manufacturing plants that it played a role there. So Dick and I started a series of lab studies with initially with Diane Liang and then other students, where we looked at transactive memory in the lab. The concept has been taken to the field. I'm looking at my list here: software development teams, consulting teams, entrepreneurial teams, top management teams. When team members perform tasks that are interdependent, it typically improves performance. Now, transactive memory, or knowledge of who knows what, helps overcome the cognitive limitations that Simon and March and Simon impressed upon us. And I think they can be a source of competitive advantage, and that's what I want to emphasize with you today. They develop from experience working together or training together, where you learn who's good at what, you observe who does tasks well, who does them poorly, you communicate about their expertise. The transactive memories are idiosyncratic. So if I put a group together with John, Koen, and Deepak, its transactive memory might be different from John, Sterman, Zur, and Dan. People have different skills, so how they divide up the tasks are different. So transactive memories are idiosyncratic to the people involved. They consist of many parts that are related and have been evolving to fit each other. And they're hard for competitors to see. So if you walked into an organization, you would not see its transactive memory. So I want to suggest that it can be a source of competitive advantage, and I think it would benefit from more empirical work looking at transactive memory, both as a mechanism explaining learning, but also as contributing to competitive advantage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. That's great. A really, really interesting additional angle here to the conversation that was initiated by Dan, and your thoughts on transactive memory systems moving forward as a key part for competitive advantage is very interesting, and exciting to learn more about that. Thank you so much. Are we okay with now going in alphabetical order, moving from here? Henrik, is that a good way to go? Can I invite you?
I'm ready, as long as I can share my slides here. There we go. Can you see me and the slides? All right. Well, first, thanks Koen, and also Christina. I hope you will see this. I'll say thank you as well for organize. this. And so I decided to talk about something that I'll call the missing middle here, and very much building, as it turns out, on Dan's and Linda's talk. The missing middle here, I mean the link between strategic intent and then the behavior that actually drives the organization forward. So on one hand, we have behavioral strategy, which, you know, I'm not an expert on it. So the way I tend to think about it is really understanding the emotional and cognitive biases that helps shape strategy, top level decision making. On the other hand, we have then decades of research on organizational learning, and here I will really focus on the team level part of the organizational learning literature, and we know a lot about how teams reflect, adapt, and improve, but rarely then do we talk about how the two connect. And the big caveat to that is here with us in the room, and that is Linda. Of course, you are one of the few people that I'm aware of who've actually done quite a lot of work in that area with transactive memory systems and linking that to dynamic capabilities, something that I have built a lot on. So in this brief presentation, then I will talk about the gap as I see it and some ideas on how to fill it. And I have, let's see if I can move this slide. We all seem to have problems with, there you go. All right, so I have 3 slides, past, present, future, following the instructions very dutifully. Past, without using the shoehorn too much, I hope. Organizational learning, and in particular then focus on team learning. What do we know? We know quite a bit on how team learning unfolds. Transactive memory systems, of course, is one important construct. We know about feedback seeking, experimentation, psychological safety. I'm currently co-editing an issue on psychological safety with Amy Edmondson in Org Science. Now we look at it broadly, but the starting point was really Amy's foundational work on how psychological safety is linked to learning. Behavioral strategy then focused very much on why decisions are made the way they are. Bounded rationality, attention, managerial cognition are some important pieces of that. And then what I would say is that these worlds have largely then been on parallel tracks. And the way I see it, there's some things lacking on these tracks. First, when it comes to organizational learning, I'd suggest that we lack a strategic reach because there's a lack of outward focus. A lot of the team learning literature is very inward focused. And then I'd suggest that the behavioral strategy, there's a lack of behavioral, let's see what's happening here. There you go. Anyway, there's just there's a lack of downward focus. The decisions are made and then implementation is sort of assumed. So the missing piece here is then the translation of team learning into action, how team learning shapes strategic intent. So that's sort of my framing of the past. The present then I frame in a very self-indulgent way around a paper that I published with my co-author Jean-Francois Harvey, Amy Edmondson, and Gary Pisano, where we took a strategic view of team learning. This was published in the Annals in 2022. And what we did is that we synthesized then 15 years of empirical research focused particularly on team learning. And we looked at this through the lens of dynamic capabilities. The core argument here was that team learning routines, that's a key link, a bridge between managerial decisions and then the development of organizational capabilities. Based on this, we developed a typology. It's not a 2x2, internal, external, exploitation, exploration. We came up with 6 different learning routines that we found fundamental. I'm not going to go through them all, but for example, we have internal exploitation, which is very much in service of reliability and efficiency. And then we have something like balanced exploration. That would be a routine that is focused both internally and in service of innovation and adaptability. Now, a key point here is that we're making, this is really the key of the paper. We're saying that these routines, they don't emerge accidentally. They're shaped by how senior leaders design teams, how they come up with composition of teams, how they structure autonomy and so on. So rather than to think about team learning routines as something that emerges randomly or as an HR issue, we frame this clearly then as a strategic lever for shaping organizational capabilities. So future then. In this paper, we outline a few things that we find under theorized. Some team learning routines in particular, such as internal exploration, which is important for innovation in particular, but perhaps because it's difficult to observe, we don't have much of that. We also don't have a lot on levers to shape balanced learning in teams, learnings that go both internally and externally. And then for me personally, I think there's a lot to be done in the multi-team system space. Team learning doesn't happen just in one team. It's hundreds of teams in most organizations, and they are connected. And that's where we really see the possibility of, if we understand more of that, well, then we will understand more of the connection between team learning and strategic outcomes. In terms of methods, we believe in mixed methods, and in particular, longitudinal research. Learning by definition is a process that happens and often in reaction to changes in the environment. And then Koen and Christina asked us to come up with some thoughts for the new generation scholars. And here I was thinking specifically about people who might want to cross between domains, OB and strategy. For people who have a home base in OB, I'd say really study routines deeply and then link it to performance, which we don't always do as a team scholar myself. And then for strategy scholars, consider those OB journals and they are increasingly interested in performance. With that, I think I should just say that I've concluded by saying that we need to stop treating team learning and team learning behavior as an afterthought. If we take it seriously as team learning routines, well, then it could be a behavioral engine for competitive advantage, and we can understand better how they evolve, how they scale, how we can shape them. Then we'll get closer to understanding that puzzle of how strategy becomes behavior and how organizational learning meets strategy. Let me end with the title of this webinar. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henrik. A wonderful, wonderful set of insights and contributions, building on what you've done here, and great to see that. I think also very nice flow from the early conversation by Dan and Linda. So really, really great to see that. Thank you. Can I invite John Joseph to move next? I think we're trying to move alphabetically here. Great.
Is that clear, the PowerPoint?
Yes,
Okay.
got it.
Great. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Koen and Christina, wherever you are. Thank you for the invitation here. So I think probably the two things that are going to echo what has been, I apologize for the glare, clear is one is focus on mechanisms, and two is a focus on levels. which I heard, I think, echo, in some of the other presentations. But let me go. I'm going to do what Henrik did and follow the the template here. So in terms of contributions, I would say, there is a lot of work, of course, on mechanisms here, in particularly behavioral strategy area. Probably the most and one of the widest empirically tested is trial and error, experiential learning, performance feedback in some form, vicarious learning or inferential learning from others. Some sort of cognitive process, anticipatory search processes through learning. And then the other one, I think, is the levels of analysis that we've seen lots of work at the individual, the group, the team, the organizational levels as well. So recognizing that actually learning does occur at multiple levels. However, this leads me to my first limitation, is that because papers often focus on a particular level, we lose perhaps a few things. One is, where is the actual locus of learning occurring? And then what is the relationship between those levels? So, if you're Giovanni Gavetti, you would say, well, this is all in the mind and we build up from there. Others, team level folks, for example, myself included, would see these situated interactions, the power and the political behavior, the formal and the distributed processes, very critical to learning. That, as Henrik mentioned, you've got teams and teams and teams and teams. Well, that has an effect beyond what any individual learns as well. I think another limitation of this research is whether we're actually capturing learning or not. So I think one of the problems is, and I think this is particularly true for strategy research, because we focus so much on outcomes and performance outcomes, that there is a huge leap between the learning and the outcome. And so, what we typically like to see is some learning and the idea that they learn the right things. And then we have outcomes that support that, we observe outcomes that support that innovation or new products or, whatever that looks like. And then on the other end of it, we have, okay, so there's no learning, there's no effort, there's no capacity, and we correspondingly don't see anything. But the problem is, and this is a problem with a lot of the empirical work, is we end up with, a tremendous amount of, cases where they don't fall in those two boxes. That either one, there's no intentional effort to learn, but we observe learning, and so we assume learning has occurred. And the other one is sort of the opposite side, is there's learning, but they learn something completely different, but we still observe no learning. So we have these two sort of off diagonals. And as I said, I think this is particularly problematic in strategy, where, a lot of the reviewers, journals, expect the so what question. And there's a bit of a gap there. The other limitation here would be, related to this is I think, lack of attention to intermediate outcomes. That, I think for strategy scholars in particular, they're going right to the performance or the so what. And I think there's a lot of richness in the potential for these intermediate outcomes as well. In terms of the present, I thought about what to say here, and there's such a distinguished group on here. So to select a few would mean to omit a few. And so I'm not going to do that. So I'll just talk about my own research, because that's the easier and safer. But I think the paper that I really want to just highlight, I'll highlight a couple here, but one that sort of addresses some of these issues. So this is a paper we published in Org Science in 2023. And we look at corporate hierarchy and organizational learnings. And essentially what we do is we combine March's mutual learning model within a corporate organization. And so essentially we look at learning at the corporate and at the business unit level, recognizing that learning, in fact, might be different at those different levels. And in fact, what we suggest is that the corporate office learns much more slowly. You can think of the fact that they're top executives, they're removed from the technical environment, they don't know what's going on all the time. It's why CEOs go on these listening tours and things like that. But at the same time, they can change the organization much more quickly, right? They can change policies, they can change HR, they can change many things. well, March made this clear in his 91, is that's a great combination for learning. Slower through turnover, but yet you can make these actions rather quickly. And so what we find that, at the end of the day, corporate has more influence on recombinant innovation. But what I think is interesting is we actually looked at the code change. So we are essentially saying that, this all happens through this mutual learning mechanism where individuals affect the code affects learning, code affects individuals. And so the reviewers, fortunately, asked us to measure this, and we did through text analysis. So it I think is illustrative of, and others are doing this here, and I'll show the slide in a second, where you are thinking about, the fact that learning is at different levels, number one. Number two, you are thinking about code change or some intermediate, intermediate mechanism, and then also not just considering necessarily performance outcomes there, but other outcomes as well. This was a paper published in 2023, and we did something. We looked at organizational learning at the business unit level, but the role of the corporate office in this. And what I want to focus on is just, again, focusing on these intermediate mechanisms, the vertical linkages and corporate attention, that actually shaped and made a difference in the heterogeneity of business unit level learning. And then we have another paper here. This is a working paper looking at multi-unit organizations with Demo and Gabriel and a PhD student, looking at the impact of organizational, the trade-off between transfer and retention, and looking at the organizational learning processes, in particular, how kinds of experience affect the firm's organization to switch attention, right? So with the idea that actually with more experience, you kind of get used to, okay, balancing multiple things, right? So, you could think of the junior scholar who has, switching back before teaching and research is very difficult, but maybe after a few years, that becomes a little bit more experienced muscle, and that, ultimately has an impact on this. So I think, there's lots of opportunities in terms of where we should go next. Well, not surprisingly, I'm going to suggest we look more at organization design choices. I think this is a really good opportunity. I think the literature in organization design is more developed than ever. This is just a smattering of lists of folks that happen to be here. But, thinking about how choices around how you configure the organization, coordination mechanisms, control, channelizing, or, you think about decision premises, have an impact, can help us address a couple things. One is, what are the organizational learning processes going on? So, creation, retention, and transfer at the multiple levels of the organization. And also get at some of these mechanisms at a way we could probably not have got at before: agendas, knowledge, beliefs, codes, vocabularies. And of course, I think the fact that text analysis is so available to us now, we've got a real opportunity to exploit this and actually measure the learning, which is something that, as I mentioned at the beginning, is something we often, I think in strategy studies in particular, often come a bit short on. And so, making this actual link to the various strategies that firms can take. And then ultimately, of course, how this impacts firm heterogeneity. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Great. John, thanks so much. And I'm adding your family name here, of course, given that we're having two Johns here joining today. So John, thanks much for these great contributions, thinking about the connection and the role of organization design, but also emphasizing the role of mechanisms and levels of analysis here. And really getting at some of the intermediate effects here of how learning takes shape. and also can be analyzed in new ways. So thanks so much for that. Really appreciate it. Let's move to here to Zur, if I'm really careful with the alphabetics here. So Zur, can I invite you? You are still muted, Zur.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me at all or not?
Yes,
You
we
can.
can.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so now I lost my slides.
Yes. Yes, we can.
So let me try to resurrect them in a minute. Sorry. Oh, that doesn't let me do that. Share. Zoom. No, that's not it. They are somewhere in here, so I'm not sure why I don't see them. I don't know. Maybe you want to go to the second John before I find them.
Sure. That sounds good, Zur.
Okay.
John, are you okay with that? Go up next.
Yeah, that's fine. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. All right,
Clear.
let me share my screen here. And 1 second. Yeah. Here we go. Okay, so you're seeing that? Great. So everybody who's come before, and I'm sure Zur as well, has really done a great job covering the history and the systems approach that's needed to really integrate organizational learning and behavioral strategy and beyond. And so I'm going to skip the history here and get right into a fundamental question for me, which is, well, why do we need organizational learning, behavioral strategy, and especially from my point of view, no surprise to any of you, why do we need system dynamics? So let me just give examples. I think the theory is great, but let me make this very practical. We know that the world is not working the way we would like, and there are enormous consequential problems, including many of the things you see here. And this is the result of what we call policy resistance, which is not the idea that we can't get what we know to be the optimal policy or even a good policy implemented. It's worse. It's the idea that we do the learning, we integrate our strategy, and we actually do implement the actions and policies that we believe are best to address the critical challenges that we face. And they either don't work, or much more insidiously, they work locally and now, but then the problem comes back often worse and over there. And that's an enormous challenge for learning and for strategy. So why does this come about? From the system dynamics point of view, it happens because our mental models are extremely limited and we have poor ability to learn from our experience. So here's a very simple idea of people learning from feedback. You have your goals, you know what the world is, you make decisions, those decisions improve the world, problem solved. It's not that simple, of course, because your mental models are imperfect and bounded and limited. And so all the other impacts of your decisions create other outcomes that feed back to change the state of the system, usually in ways that people don't want. We typically interpret these as side effects. It came from out there, it wasn't my fault, but they're not. There's no such thing as side effects. There's just effects. The ones you thought about in advance, those are the main effects, and everything else, it appears to people, is something that came from out there, a side effect. Of course, it's way more complicated than that because you're not the only actor in the system. You've got, if you're a company, you've got your customers, your employees, your competitors, your supply chain partners, the financial markets, the regulators, the natural world that's providing all the resources you need and absorbing all the wastes you generate. They have their own goals, which differ from yours. But since we all share the same world, when you pull the system closer to your goals, you're usually pulling it farther from theirs. Those folks also have limited mental models and produce so-called side effects. And now this is a very complex system, and Dan alluded to this. And typically, we need to expand the boundaries of our models. Otherwise, we're going to miss important feedbacks, and there could be long time delays in all of these links. This is very challenging for learning, and that's why we see, as John Joseph nicely pointed out, many, many cases where there's no learning or false learning, superstitious learning, harmful learning, which then feeds back to alter strategy. So let me give you a very concrete example. What do all of these have in common? So the Deepwater Horizon accident, the Norfolk Southern derailment, the Boeing crashes, the Camp Fire in Paradise, California that bankrupted PG&E, the blackouts in Spain and Portugal just within the month, and what's going on at Newark Airport right now, and tragically, many children, you see just one example here, dying in foster care. I think they're all examples of what we call the capability trap. Capability trap is different from Dan and Jim's competence trap. There's a long set of papers that have come out of the system dynamics tradition. You see some of them here. And my colleague Nelson Repenning, who developed the capability trap idea with me, and his partner Don Kiefer are coming out with a book this summer, There's Got to Be a Better Way, which is a very practical, let's call it a manual for how organizations can escape from these capability traps. So what's the capability trap? How does it work? Well, very simple systems diagram here. Performance of organizations depends on how hard people are working and their capabilities, plural. And this connects to the resource-based view and dynamic capabilities that have been addressed already. And then there's goals, right? And if there's a performance shortfall, the most obvious, fastest, safest, most reliable way to close that gap is for people to work harder. And it works like this. Our goals are raised. That creates the gap. People work harder, overtime, no breaks, skip lunch, etc. Performance goes up, and that closes the gap. Problem solved. And people learn very effectively that that's how you solve problems. But wait a minute, there's another option. You could interpret the performance shortfall as evidence that our capabilities aren't what they need to be. And in that case, you've got this additional feedback loop. So shortfall leads to more improvement effort, more learning, more capability development. That all happens with a lag. And Linda spoke nicely about knowledge erosion. So almost everybody I talk to about this, they think if you increase your investment in capabilities, then capabilities automatically go up. That's wrong. Capabilities are stocks. So you could increase investment, but capabilities won't start to grow until investment exceeds the erosion of your capabilities, the loss of knowledge, which is happening all the time because people retire, turn over, laid off, technology changes, competitive situations change, et cetera, et cetera. But if you can do that, if you can raise investment above the erosion of your knowledge, then capabilities grow, performance goes up, and you've closed the shortfall. There's enormous number of biases against working smarter here. And in fact, when I asked a group of executives one year, what about that working smarter feedback that you see? One of them said, well, yeah, in my organization, we call that the it ain't never going to happen feedback. There's a bigger problem, though, which is that there's only so many hours in the day. So if work effort goes up in the short run to deal with the current crisis, which it always will, that reduces improvement effort, and that leads to an erosion of your capabilities. Performance then falls later, and the shortfall gets bigger. Now we have to work everybody even harder, and around we go in a vicious cycle that often leads to the kinds of deadly accidents I just shared with you. So what are the dynamics here? Well, here's a factory. Think about it as maybe a chemical plant or any factory. They're doing pretty well. Small amount of equipment failures that lead to a certain amount of reactive maintenance, a lot of proactive work that includes learning and training and capability development. But then there's a recession or a Doge comes along or whatever it might be, and everybody has to cut costs. Well, the maintenance department gets their cost reduction from the training, the preventive maintenance, the learning, because they have to fix things that are broken. And the very first thing that happens is uptime goes up because all the equipment that would have been taken down for maintenance is now continuing to run. But then what happens, of course, is performance deteriorates, and that squeezes more and more of the learning and proactive activity out of the system as the maintenance, the reactive repair maintenance burden grows. And you end up with an organization that pays more, less profitable, and you get less. It's unsafe, it's unreliable, customers don't like you. So that's the capability trap. How do you get out of it? Well, most people just stay stuck in it. But if you did try to get out of it, the very first thing that happens is everything gets worse. You have to spend more money to get your capabilities to improve. And the very first thing with performance is it goes down because now you have to take that small amount of equipment that's still operating and take it offline. You have to take people out of any learning or training that's going on and put them on the line to produce. So the first thing that happens is everything gets worse. And the very next thing that happens is we abandon the program. And this is what people learn over and over again. And then they blame the tools. Oh, we had the wrong consultants, the wrong process improvement methodology. If you stick to your guns, though, then eventually what happens is you can get back to high performance. But notice the worse before better trade-off. This is very challenging for learning. And it's why you see so many of those fatal episodes and many more. So can you get out of the trap? Here's just one example. This happened at the Broad Institute, the genomic research operation in Cambridge. This was done by one of our alums, Sheila. They were deeply stuck in the capability trap in 2012. Turnaround time was ridiculously long. Demand was falling. Their machine utilization for genomic analysis was less than 50%. And they were able to use the tools that I just showed you and Nelson Repenning's dynamic work design principles to completely turn it around. Factor of 10 improvement in delivery time. Utilization went way up. And then when the pandemic hit, they were able to pivot almost instantly to doing PCR testing. And MIT used this along with many other organizations in the Northeast. Average turnaround time for test results was less than a day, and the costs were really low. There's no question this saved a huge number of lives. So just an example, there's many other examples where the dynamic perspective and modeling, concrete modeling of this can make a difference. But let me sum up by a couple of thoughts that I would hope the folks on this webinar would take up. So if we want to really understand organizational learning and integrate it effectively with strategy for success, as well as theory development, we need to expand the boundaries of our models by focusing on feedback and endogenous explanations for what's going on. It's fundamentally multidisciplinary. We've heard this theme already today, but let me just give my thought on this. I go to a lot of conferences in operations management, in economics, in energy, climate, which is my main focus. And I got to tell you, I get very frustrated. You go to the economics conferences and it's all about a toy model with optimal agents and perfect foresight. You go to the operations and energy and engineering conferences, there's no people in their models. It's just, here's how the technology works. And here's, let's assume there's a queuing system with Poisson arrivals, and now we'll have an optimal policy. And then we talk about we go to the conferences for many of the folks on this, and there are exceptions, but, in many cases, there's not enough physics, there's not enough operations, there's not enough of the engineering realities. You think about the capability trap, it's not just that people are learning from outcome feedback, that's happening simultaneously to people learning from action feedback, where their actions not only give them outcome feedback that they can use to learn, maybe, but also change the world so that the situation is now different and what they learned is no longer relevant. So I think we have to address this in our work going forward. There's many different modeling architectures that can help there. And we need to have a rigorous evidence base, of course. And the last thing I'd say is, along the lines of the examples I gave earlier and many other highly consequential challenges that we're facing in our world today, let's make sure we all aim high in what we tackle for our research. Happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. Really, really exciting and interesting presentation here, and wonderful to see, your thoughts on, the role of system dynamics, specifically also the ones that you lay out on capability trap. Really nice to see some of those aspects combined in your thinking, and also the impact that has had on practice. Very, very interesting. Thank you for that. Without further ado, and in order to stick to keep time in somewhat manageable here, let's move to Zur. Can you unmute maybe? Super. There we go. Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, you're doing great.
Can you see a slide?
Yes.
Yes, as well.
I got to make it a slide.
Maybe you can put it in presentation mode.
Yeah, that's what I would like to do. Okay, so I get some assistance. No, this is the, yeah, this is this one. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Great,
Thank you so much for bringing me. I'll try to speak a little bit faster because of the time. So I did what my students do. I asked ChatGPT, when was the first academic article on organizational learning? This was in 1965. So when Koen talks about the past, I'll bring something a little bit earlier than that. Surprisingly, also, the first article with the title on strategic management was in 1962. So we go back really to March and Simon, 1958. But I wanted to share with you some other things. So in the past, I'll go back. Learning was studied by psychologists in Germany in the 19th century, not in 1965. And a lot of stuff emerged from individual learning, in particular, as some people who were part of the cognitive revolution in 1956 referred to Skinner, not Skinner the strategy guy, but Skinner the psychologist, as the dark days of Skinner. And they basically looked at things that people start to follow Tolman, who basically ran probably one of the first experiments that were very, very interesting. What he did, he let mice go through a maze where at the end they got some reward in terms of food. But then he had some other mice go through the maze without food. And then this was the training session. In the experimental session, he let them go into a similar sort of maze, and those guys who got the food performed much worse than the first guys. And the idea is that they learned something about mazes when just walking around rather than focus on the incentives, which is the follow John Sterman. Economists talk only about the incentives. Nothing else runs, okay? The cognitive revolution led to a lot of changes. And this is the past, okay? And I'll talk about the present by talking about, not about my contributions, but on some of the things of the other, so maybe it's good that I'm last, right? So, of course, Linda, these are things that influenced me, okay? Transactive memory, and also learning in franchise-type organizations, something that is well known as the pizza study. I'm not going to delve into that. And Bresman talks about diversity in the psychological safety. How about the strategy team sitting up with the CEO who says something and all of them, follow the CEO because they're worried about being fired, as it happens now in Washington, okay? My colleague, Christina Fang, is not with us today, but what she did is she followed on Tolman and did a study of organizational learning, a credit assignment, which is very, very interesting. John Joseph, what I'll do is he studies with Willie Ocasio about General Electric for the methodology in that respect. They looked at data from 1940 to 2006. Most people in SMJ, as John Sterman commented on, they run regressions on current data sets. They don't talk to nobody. With all these great contributions, I think one of the things is the relatively early paper with Jim March on the myopia of learning, but overlooking distant time, distant places, distant failure. I'll add that a student of Jim called Omar El-Sawi once interviewed a lot of Egyptian businessmen and found out that they were able to go back in the past in order to predict the future much better. And John, you know, the existing stock and flow, you know, which I try to talk in my class and get failure all the time, even from the students, you know, he pointed that that's very clearly. What I think is important in talking about organizations and strategic decisions is the issue of the flow of information. And we have seen that in many situations. So let me go back to this one. Current, not so current, October, 2023, sorry for bringing war into it. The Yom Kippur War 50 years before that was then not really replicated, but 96% replicated. Still, there are a lot of problems there because information does not flow up. And my suggestion for any CEO, yes, go down to the environment. This is a model with Elad Green that was published in the Advances in Strategic Management. And basically the idea, so it's a theoretical model, but I can see that happening all the time, where basically what you have is people at the lower level, those guys who look at the environment, like these observant soldiers, poor soldiers, female soldiers in Israel, who looked and tried to send message up, but the officers above them said, shut up or else we put you in jail, because they didn't trust them, okay? So we have a model that basically talk about, the fact that, forget about this, but the idea is this guy who finds something here has to put in her mind, should I try to get the CEO or the next level, and so on. And the flow of information is of utmost importance, and we tend to forget that. I'll take John Joseph. Okay, you learn at multi-levels. Do they pass up? No. In most cases, it doesn't pass up. Where doesn't it pass us? Okay. In the case that I cited here is the plenty of available information. There were organizational politics. There were differential interpretation, and there's overall different conceptions, frameworks, and paradigm. You can think about Pearl Harbor. You can think about 9/11. In 9/11, if you don't know, because I lived in the building that oversees the towers, okay? And they tried to bomb the towers in 1993, and in 2003, I think it was the first time. And when they caught up a guy who was the mastermind from New Jersey, they caught him in Afghanistan, who basically planned that thing. They flew him to the States and took him in a helicopter over Manhattan. And the American, FBI guy told him, the sheik, told him, listen, this is the building that you tried to bomb. You can't do that. And the answer was, not yet. Okay? So we get a lot of information. We get information about hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, helicopter crashing, planes that don't succeed in Newark and other places. In contrast, and I don't talk about expertise, Bill Gates almost lost Microsoft when two of his associates went to Cornell University many years ago and found out that what the professors were doing, all of them, they're talking about communication in email and stuff. And Bill Gates was focused on the box, building the new box of Microsoft, and it took them 9 months to get his attention. And once he got his attention, got the idea, he turned over, 180 degrees and saved basically Microsoft. Again, this is a case of information flow because these guys were associates. They couldn't get his his attention and time to think about sort of what goes on. So what can one suggest? Okay, so basically, I think that the idea of information flow, what you need to go up to the CEO in this case, or the chief of staff or whatever, is a two-way process. And I'm surprised that from MIT, there was a guy called Shannon who basically talked to us about information flowing in two directions, right? And most of the studies that are done in networks and social science are just posting a picture of the people where they stand. That's not the only thing important. The important thing is, what do they talk about? Well, despite a few studies of email or whatever, we really don't know. So my sense of that is basically what we need to do, and then talk about experiments and experience. Experience may be problematic, and Jim's last book is about the ambiguity of experience. But for strategic decision making, you know, experiments may be good. And by the way, I'm an experimental social psychologist. Okay, don't get me wrong. I ran a lot of experiments. You run experiment in order to test a theory, not to find new things. All right, okay? And you find new things if you really go to the, you know, go to the organizations, go to, you know, to look for disaster or other places that John Sterman just talked about. And I'd say that my mentor, the guy I did my master's degree with, the guy called Daniel Kahneman, published a book that I'm still surprised why a lot of executives buy it, especially because he has an appendix of prospect theory that not only help them, but nobody understands, okay? And basically he called it think fast, think slow. And my take on that, and that's what I teach my students, is think fast, decide slow. And the point is, if I look at what Danny wrote, what Jim March talked, what John Sterman talked, is go slow when you have to make decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zur. It's great, I think, to have you, you know, give us this overview and also related to, you know, some of the key works of folks here, you know, in our panel, and really interesting to have you also pick out some of the key thoughts on, you know, where some of the gaps are. Or really also liked, you know, the idea of the non-sharing and the moving up of knowledge and the lack of sharing across different levels in the organization. Just to pick out, you know, one of your thoughts and contributions here. Many thanks for that too. I'm looking at time, and I think we're you know, we're at the end of our session. Maybe if all of you are okay with that, I will ask, you know, our participants to have, you know, to ask maybe one or two questions if everyone is okay with that, so that you know, our participants also have a chance to you know, to share a question if they like. Is someone you know, really keen to have a question that we can get a short answer from our panel on? Feel free to come in as and open up the camera and your mic.
Or
I think everyone's over.
Like
we
an
could
MBA
call on people. We could cold call somebody.
Yeah, well, I guess you know, people are pretty impressed and overwhelmed here too, and I don't want to keep people's time here. I would like to you know, if that's okay with you, is there anyone, I don't want to step on anyone's toes here, any pressing questions or, you know, thoughts from our folks here? I have maybe one question if no one else wants to step up here, which again, I don't want to take away any opportunity here. But I guess, I mean, you know, maybe just as a question, I think we've had, you know, many interesting insights, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists here for our contributions. Is someone, you know, one of our panelists able or willing to maybe just pick out one, you know, of the areas where we think, you know, this is really one of the most promising areas, looking across what we've heard from our panelists, right? Because each and every one of you has offered really interesting insights on specific elements, you know, across the organizational learning and behavioral strategy domains. Does someone want to kind of, you know, illuminate or pick out one or two aspects here that I think that he or she thinks are under highlighted, or that really should, you know, warrant additional final thinking here? Broad question, you know, looking for a specific answer, I guess.
Well, I'll just, one thing I think I heard multiple people say, including myself, was, you know, we talked about multiple levels of analysis here, but I think what Zur certainly mentioned, what John certainly mentioned, which Dan certainly mentioned, Linda, really everybody was cross-level. So this isn't just about, something happening at a particular level, but that there are cross-level things happening, like communication, like information processing, like interpretation. And I think that's actually quite critical if we're going to understand this at the organizational level, that we can't just rely on, a very sort of narrow view, because that's not how, it happens. And I think everybody has tools that would allow us to do that text analysis. One, or maybe RCTs that incorporate that, but that might be something.
Yeah, great set of thoughts. I see John Sterman. You were also raising your hand or finger there to add in.
Oh, I was just giving the thumbs up, strongly endorse what John Joseph said there, and not just multi-level, but multi-function, multi-organization. You cannot learn effective strategy, in my view, unless you're taking account of all of these different stakeholders in today's world, and including the physics of the systems, right? The natural world that constrains and enables certain choices you have. So strongly endorsing John's perspective there.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to take this opportunity to also, on behalf of the other leaders within STR, to say a major and big thanks. I think this was really, really exciting. I think, there was so many different thoughts and suggestions that are inspiring, the field and also our participants here. Obviously, the video will also be, posted on YouTube for people to watch later on. So once again, a major and big thanks to you, all of our 6 panelists, for a great contribution. And looking forward to some of the, future work that will be coming out, picking up on the thoughts that you've been sharing here. So all of you, big thanks. Also on behalf of Christina, of course, and I look forward to seeing you at one of the future events and to discussing our field of study further. Many thanks and all the best. And also Dave and Paolo, thanks for all the support, along with Deepak, of course. All the best.